It's the Redbird Reboot podcast. Are you ready to get rebooted, Cardinals fans? He settles down, at least in the zone, and does not stop running.
Blake Murphy.
This is the identity for the Arizona Cardinals.
The run defense is just horrendous, and it's been horrendous for the Cardinals for a long time.
And Marcos Labrada.
He's going to bring over his philosophy. It should make it better.
Present the hottest NFL podcast from the country's hottest state.
He should be turning around the logo.
Actually, some breaking news we can cover here. This popped up just about, 6 minutes ago.
It's Redbird Reboot.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans. It's been a while. Thank you guys so much. This is the Redbird Reboot podcast in the middle of the Cardinals off season. We got a couple of stories we can talk about here. I'm Blake Murphy. We've got Marcos Labrada, aka Pancake Soul, joining us. And Marcos, it has been a while. This is the time of year where it's baseball season, it's NBA draft and off season. The National Football League is essentially on a break, but there's always something to be able to talk about. If it's not Aaron Rodgers, it's going to be other news that drops. We'll get into some of that as far as catching up on, a little bit of wrapping up some OTAs, previewing training camp, and then a little bit of NFL collusion news, at least we can tap into, of which Kyler Murray, Michael Bidwell, and Steve Keim all played a part. But before we get started, how are you doing today, sir?
And my apologies about the sound. We have to get this going really quick, but I'm doing pretty good, with the exception of the fact that I can't get this thing going. So apologies about the audio once again. There's been there's been a lot of news that we've been waiting for to gather all together to get into a podcast. Usually, this is the dead period, so we just hear little things here and there. But yeah, the collusion thing is actually a pretty interesting topic that we can go over which we will today. But yeah, I've been doing really well. How about you?
Yeah, no, it's been good. I think a lot of it we talked about too has been just the busyness where you can take advantage of the off season to kind of work on a few other things. At least I know there's been a lot that's been happening, at least with on my end for family. But when it comes to Cardinals football, just one of those times where it's at the start of July, training camp is at the end, and right now we are just anticipating that to get going. Let's go ahead before we kind of jump into the most modern spot. Let's rewind a little bit, go back to some of what we saw with the OTAs, some of the other training camp, all of these expectations that we have. Usually when you go into training camp, it's going to be a continuation of OTAs. And with the Arizona Cardinals, one of the things that we got to see in OTAs was couple of guys who were out with injuries. We saw Calais Campbell had some time off, Dalvin Tomlinson some time off. Will Johnson was kind of limited one of the days, came back and practiced in the future. For the most part, Marcos, I think that with the Cardinals having a roster that's mostly all young guys with now a couple of aging veterans, this is something that I think a lot of times we don't really need to be as concerned about for the most part, but I will bring up an interesting exception. Back in 2023, DJ Humphries was not there as far as practicing for the Cardinals OTAs. He ended up playing almost the entire season in 2023 before he got hurt. You ended up seeing the right tackle, Paris Johnson, moved and took over for him. That was kind of an early indication with those practices because the draft was bumped back that year. Because Jonathan Gannon got an early start as a new head coach, we got to kind of get a little last second glimpse going, Humphries may not be long for this Cardinals team. It might be that instead of taking that edge rusher or making a huge trade back for a bunch of picks, taking, that impact defensive player, maybe the Cardinals need a left tackle of the future. With some of the guys who were out, at least with OTs, I think it's easy to say we've got no concerns, but is there anything that you think we should look at as far as some Cardinals fans are already wondering, hey, is Will Johnson fell due to injuries? Are they taking it slow? Is there something to be concerned about? Some of the other veteran players that we have, at least here, how much do you think we need to factor in everything from OTAs and health versus, hey, we're starting training camp and these guys are still not quite ready to get out there? That would likely include the players such as a BJ Ojulari, who tore his ACL in camp last year and is still, from what we've been able to see, not ready and out there to practice yet.
Yeah, that one's the BJ Ojulari one that kind of not really pissed me off, but it kind of really concerns me that He's still not ready to go out there and whatnot. We barely even seen any action from BJ. With the other players, I wouldn't be so much concerned. We knew that Will Johnson was going to be an easy process, and when we took him, the whole reason why they selected him in the second round was because people were having, like, teams were having concerns about his injuries. Um, as far as other players are concerned, I would say that we would have to wait like till training camp is officially open because that's when they go full on, workout and stuff, black and white, um, like practices and whatnot or games and whatnot. So in that aspect, if those players are still not ready, something's going on here with their injuries that it's like pushing them back further than what it should be because some of these players are actually key players. They're supposed to go into year two or year three or year one actually to be able to help out with this team. They're supposed to be key players. Like BJ, for example, he's on year three. He missed out all year two. Year three was supposed to be his okay, he's gonna come back
Yeah.
fully
Missed out
healthy.
most of year one as well, with coming off an
That
injury from the draft too. Yeah.
exactly. So we barely even seen anything from BJ or Jalari. And from what we've seen, it's one of those situations where you look at the film and you see something and you're like, okay, that's good. Let's see what that looks like in an entire span of a year. What he had like 4 sacks his rookie season, but he didn't play the entire season. So you're thinking to yourself, he should be an 8 sack person locked in, but he can't even stay on. He can't even get out there. So that's the one that concerns me the most. Everybody else, I'll just wait and see.
Absolutely. The other name, at least, that popped up that was during the voluntary workouts and missing some time, which sometimes there are personal things going on, but Akeem Davis Gaither seems like he is right now the likeliest guy to take over at that will linebacker position. What it seems to be the case is after Kaiser White has left the team, Kaiser was essentially in that we call Mike linebacker role, but a lot of the times he would kind of be between the Mike and then being that kind of blitzer um, where you'd allow Mac Wilson to be off of the edge, and then Buda Baker would kind of be within the Cardinals defense. They would rotate guys on the back end, you'd rotate guys up front, and it would essentially be kind of allowing Buda to be that main on-ball guy to be able to go ahead and rack up some of those tackles when it wasn't, and Buda was either pushed into coverage or being able to, maybe it's in a pass rush or a blitz, you would see Kaiser there. So the fact that Davis Gaither was in kind of a position to like seize that. And instead, it was Cody Simon who got quite a few reps as a result. It'll be interesting to me to see how that linebacker spot plays out because you have at least one guaranteed starter in Mac Wilson, one assumed starter in Owen Papo. And then it's going to be between Davis Gaither, the rookie, even having a guy like a Michael Walker is going to be interesting to see. Now, let's talk
Yeah,
about the other big news that popped up, at least. Now, we'd heard a little wind of some of this a while back. I think the PHNX guys were some of the ones who actually went public with it because they had some sources behind it. But Sean Murphy Bunting, Cardinals cornerback, earned himself an unsavory reputation last year, which I think in some cases you can say it was deserved. There was some struggles in terms of ball awareness and single coverage, especially on the deep ball. There's also areas where like it was part of the struggles the Cardinals cornerbacks had last year. They essentially had Garrett Williams being their main slot cornerback, who was able to be just a lockdown guy out of the slot. You had a good kind of way of scheming up some of the linebackers to cover guys over the middle. So really the guys that were on the outside were kind of put into the most difficult spot. So you had a combination of Starling Thomas, Sean Murphy Bunting to start the year. Ended up being Max Melton taking over throughout much of the time. Murphy Bunting got hurt, from what we know, at least it seems like it was some sort of basketball injury, and he is going to be out for the season for Arizona, which is unfortunate because when it comes to injuries, if it's at the training facility, we talk about how it goes in with the NFL, guaranteed contracts. You can't just be able to look and say that guys should just do nothing with their athleticism and just essentially just sit around on the couch, make sure they don't get hurt. But at the same time, there are risks for some risky behaviors that can pop up if you are going to be kind of treating things hard. He was in a spot at least where he would probably have gone into this season still fighting for a starting job, but with how Jonathan Gannon works, probably would have at least been able to have been needed to lose his job versus having to like be outright handed to it to Will Johnson. And as a result, now it seems very likely that the Cardinals, they don't have to be able to have all of his contract because of that being able to be paid, since it was an offseason injury. How those things get settled, a lot of times you'll end up seeing like injury designation and release, where Arizona will pay a certain portion of the money, player will get released. The way that the CBA works is that the player is not going to just be cut from the team straight up, at least, even with injury settlements. You're going to see that usually for guys who are in a last year of their deal or was a free agent. Like, think of like your practice squad promotions, or like they're on just the 1 year sort of deal. Because he's got money for next year, and with how the contract works, and because of being a veteran, Arizona is probably going to have him on the roster. He'll be on the non-football injury list for probably the whole season, and will probably get released next year with a sort of injury settlement. But he's going to be rehabbing using Arizona's facilities, rehabbing on Arizona's dime. And it's one of those cases where, Marcos, we can talk a little bit about with how Monty Onsenfort, has come in and been able to establish with some decent draft picks, be able to restock the pantry for the Cardinals. They have really found kind of only 2 stars thus far, at least. Now it's only entering year 3, so again, we still have a year or 2 left before we can make some judgments. But between Sean Murphy-Bunting, some of the offensive tackles, such as Bilal Nichols, missing time with Darius Robinson last year, Justin Jones being another, there's not been these home run sort of hits in free agency for the Cardinals. There's been quite a few misses. Some of that is the nature of free agency, but it is kind of interesting to see a little bit of a gap between how Steve Keim treated free agency, bringing guys in, and how Monty Ossenford has brought some guys in, because there's a few of their players that are going to probably be cut and released that just have not worked out. And Sean Murphy-Bunting, guy they trusted to kind of be their top cornerback for the most part, he's one of them. And now the Cardinals are back to a all young, I think the oldest, most veteran player now is going to be Garrett Williams in that cornerback room moving forward.
Yeah, so it's like the Rod Graves approach and whatnot. Like, if you remember, you can hear me fine, right? I don't need this thing anymore right here. Okay, good. All right, so the Rod Graves approach was, hey, let's draft these guys, let's develop them, let's get them all young, let's build the core, and mostly just let's focus on the defensive side. And then offense was mostly just trying to get like free agents that are like big splash free agents, which it's not a great approach. It's not really going to work. You have to do it on both sides. But on defense, it really did work because you drafted a bunch of these players in the first, second, and third round, and you had these guys in your room developing, becoming the true Cardinals. You know, this is my home. This is where you drafted me and whatnot. Calais Campbell was part of that room. It was Calais. It was Darnell Dockett. It was Carlos Dansby. All these names that old Cardinals fans are just like starting to get like nostalgia over because they remember these players in the room. You even could add Patrick Peterson to that, even though Patrick Peterson, I believe, wasn't a Rod Graves pick. He might have been a Steve Keim pick. I'm not 100% sure. You're gonna have to check me on that. But if he was a Rod Graves pick, you can add him to that room. You have Daryl Washington part of that room. You even had Dan Williams, who only played like 4 years with this Cardinals team, but he only played 4 years because he got himself, or 5 years because he got himself a good contract with the Raiders because he was a really good a nose tackle. He went over there and fizzled out, unfortunately. So that was a team that you built on your own, so that by the time someone like Bruce Arians came around, he didn't have to worry about the defense because the defense already had its pieces together. He already had all their core players who are like either getting to their prime, or some of them, unfortunately, like Darnell Dockett, was already passing his prime. But the whole point was you drafted that whole group together. So that's exactly what he's trying to do at the same time, getting some big key free agent pieces. He had some band-aid pieces in Sean Murphy-Bunting. Yet Sean Murphy-Bunting had no business playing outside cornerback. That guy was a slot corner with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers when he was even perceived as good. That guy was having his blemishes covered by the outside corners, and of course, being so lucky to play with Antoine Winfield and those safeties with Tampa Bay. That's what covered up and masked up what he could do. I mean, if you have somebody like what is the defensive coordinator, the great defensive coordinator, Todd Bowles, being able to orchestrate a defense like the way he did, you're gonna look good in the system. Now, when he came over here and we asked him, "Hey, you're the number one corner," I thought to myself, I don't know if that's gonna work. Maybe he can because he's the most veteran player in our team. We have no choice. And this is exactly what happened. Fans are just like, no, just get him out of here. We don't care if he gets injured. So I like this approach. I like building and trying to go with the shotgun approach on defense and getting your defensive line, picking those guys high and trying to develop these players at the same time and just make another iteration of the 2008 defensive Cardinals that weren't that good, but good enough to be able to get us to the Super Bowl. All right, you're mute.
Yeah, we can also talk, at least I know a little bit, with just some of the other players. Like I think Dana R, thanks for tuning in with our show. Dana talks about people forget about Elijah Jones. I know some people we've talked about like Elijah Jones better than
Love
the
you,
Max
Dana.
Melton pick. I was not one of those people, at least, but partially because of like there's a lot of people who do film evaluations, grading. Like I very much am looking at kind of how you combine a lot of that with the physical measurables because there's so few people who actually have the physical abilities to be able to do like what it takes to be an outside corner in the National Football League. So it is, like you said, one of those cases where we have a whole lot of question marks heading into camp. And one of the biggest cases that we'll be able to figure out, of course, is what's going to be going with the offensive line. So we can talk one more thing about how we took and take away from the rest of our OTAs in practice, which is going to be the starting offensive line. So while there's things you can or can't report on for the most part, what we can say is Isaiah Adams is going into everything planning on having the starting job. He had gotten the most reps at right guard throughout OTAs. And where it really comes down to is that it's going to be a competition ultimately between him, Royce Newman, with John Gaines kind of being the backup center / backup left guard. There is probably not a good chance at all that Hayden Connor sees snaps this year. The big question, of course, is going to end up being for a lot of Cardinals fans, is this going to be the year where you can say that Christian Jones looks like is going to be ready to potentially take on another step next year or go into competition? Or you're going to be looking at least at this is a year of Jonah Williams, a year of Kelvin Beachum being the backup, and you're going to probably be entering into 2026 in need of a new outside, instead of a new outside, I should say, right side specifically tackle. Those are some of the things we can look at as far as training camp goes, Marcos. And I'm very curious, at least, to see because right now the team's roster, for the most part, I would argue, is pretty well set. We'll pull up a depth chart here, at least for those who are watching on our YouTube side, at least to see. But right now, the depth chart with Arizona, you're probably going to be seeing at least the offensive line entering into this year, injuries notwithstanding, pretty much is going to be set. So watching at least any other position battles, the one position battle on the offensive side that I think will be very interesting to me is going to be the slot receiver, because you've got essentially Zay Jones is a guy who is last year what we got to see. He ended up being kind of the main slot guy over Greg Dortch for some rays to end the year. He also spent some time outside. We saw Michael Wilson, at least kind of when injuries kind of took, he ended up taking a step back. He's ever had more, I believe, than 600 yards receiving in a season, and they're hoping for a 1,000-yard season from him. Greg Dortch, as we've talked about, as one of those guys who just fills this kind of gadget role super well, is able to get open versus zone, quick enough against press when he gets to kind of work out of the slot. Not a guy you want to kind of move outside as much as this Kyler Murray and the offense is concerned. The one guy who's got some speed ultimately is Xavier Weaver. So Dortch not being necessarily a true deep threat, but being able to be one of those guys who, in some cases, I'd argue you kind of have a little bit of the get open and get the ball, beat one-on-one coverage sort of role. It's kind of what they drafted Marvin Harrison Jr. for. It's part of what they ended up drafting the likes of Trey McBride for against a lot of other guys to get matchups. You're probably going to be looking at least at, if you're going to be one speed guy to watch over, if Xavier Weaver is able to kind of capture a little bit more of a role, then there's a very interesting kind of possibility where could you end up seeing someone like a Greg Dortch make the wide receiver 5? Could there be a team that needs a receiver? That would be, I think, on offense, the biggest battle ultimately to watch, because Marcos, for everything else in the offensive side in training camp, there's no questions. They didn't make any changes. The backups, as far as the running backs, the tight ends, everything is pretty much set. There was no new additions besides the backup quarterback and a few more competing pieces on the offensive line. That's where I think ultimately the defense, Marcos, is what's going to be more interesting, because you are going to have guys like a Starling Thomas, Will Johnson, looking at the health of a BJ Ojolari, and then of course the inside linebacker spot. All of these things, I think, for what we're looking at with Arizona, the defense is really where the intrigue is going to rely on, especially when it comes down to the final 53-man roster.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you learned about the whole Pro Football Networks. Either it's that or I forgot what it was. It is Pro Football Network. They put the Cardinals at the number fifth spot for the offense. That pretty much putting them out as elite. And there was talks about like can this team be elite and whatnot. And of course, people say undoubtedly so because of the players that we have. I would say that even though the question marks are like, oh, can Drew Petzing and Kyler Murray figure this out, or can Drew Petzing work with Kyler Murray and get better, or can Kyler Murray get better and whatnot? That's not the question mark here. The question mark here is whether or not you are gonna get better when it comes to like targeting that middle part of the field more effectively than you did last year. Now, Kyler Murray did target that part of the field more often than he usually does. It doesn't mean he was more effective at it. It just means that he was targeting it more because here's the thing about this type of offense that Drew Petzing likes to run. It's the West Coasty, Kyle Shanahan type of offense that the Cardinals fans have been banging the table for since Cliff Kingsbury's been the offensive coordinator slash coach for the Cardinals. So now that we got it, this is exactly how you got to execute it. So he did a really good job when it came to play action. He was one of the best at play action. He 100% proved me wrong in that aspect about like being able to execute that part of offense. So good on him on that. But on a down by down basis from the shotgun, he was actually worse than he's been in his entire career. So that is the majority of the plays right there. That's what needs to be figured out for them to get there. And if they do that, they will be a top five offense. I'm not even going to say it's not even possible. Yes, it is possible for them to get there as soon as they figure that out. Now, for the defensive side, yes, you're right. That is where the intrigue is because we have so many variables that we have no account for. And I'm actually excited for that part to be more, sustainable because of the fact that you have all these players there.
Yeah, the biggest thing I think on the defensive side, and this is checking out with how training camp goes, how healthy your two veterans that you signed the big money free agents in Calais Campbell and Dalvin Tomlinson are. You're going to see a rotation. You're going to look at Darius Robinson, who looked very good in training camp, at least to start his rookie season. And then, of course, he had a lot that happened with him. That's one of those players that you'd like to see him hit because it makes things easier. If you end up going into next year and you're like, all right, Walter Nolan, we've got him at least where he's been able to kind of take on a bigger role, take over for, some of what we saw with a Calais Campbell potentially in his final season. You'll see at least Darius Robinson hopefully be able to slide into that other spot. Where it becomes complicated is you need to be able to at least see that you're going to be able to have a very clear picture of where to improve and where to go in the offseason. This year for the Cardinals, it became pretty clear they're either going to be taking a right tackle who may or may not be starting to end the season, will be kind of sitting on the bench, or they'll be more like taking an impact defensive lineman. We got closer to the draft. A lot of people obviously really wanted Will Johnson because they felt they needed a number one corner as well. For me, it comes down to the end of the roster. So the Cardinals, with the guarantees they've paid LJ Collier, it seems likely that he's going to be set. You're also talking at least about with how they run their 3-4 defense. Mostly it's going to be the linebackers and pass rushers with a couple of defensive ends. So having a veteran like Collier makes sense. The thing it comes down to is the interior defensive line has some intrigue. You've got Bilal Nichols, at least, is one of those guys who the question is he going to be a cut candidate? You have Justin Jones in the same spot. Dante Stills, the former 6th round pick, is also going to be up there. Cardinals signed Elijah Simmons. A lot of people like him as a run stuffer to an undrafted free agent contract as well. And then, of course, you've got that 1st round pick in Walter Nolan, who's there. This is where it's going to set up of you're probably going to have to see at least of that group, if not two, at least for sure one of Nichols, Jones, Stills, and probably even Simmons are probably going to either be cut or in some cases potentially The one that seems most likely in Dante Stills seeming to be a trade candidate. That's something, at least, that when you throw that in there, along with the likes of having a Jordan Birch who's having to figure out his spot as a linebacker, having Zayvon Collins alongside BJ Ojolari, the front seven for Arizona is where all the intrigue ultimately is. And part of that, Marcos, is they were supposed to have a solid front seven last year. It didn't work out that way due to injury. It was really Dante Stills being the one guy that you could essentially count on. And you had signed under contract where he wasn't going to go elsewhere, like the likes of I'm trying to think through at least Pride of Mesquite, Michael Roy Lopez, for example. That's where most of all the intrigue is going to be. There's also a little bit as far as its safety to see how Arizona rotates through, because you've got your two starters, you've got your Rabbit, Dadrian Taylor Demerson, you've got your two guys in Joey Blunt and Keaton Crawford who are going to be your special teams gunners. So that puts the corner room into question too. What of the guys, as far as Keitrell Clark, is Elijah Jones one of those guys who, we talk about all the time? There's always going to be a player who ends up hitting. It just takes an extra year. There's always going to be that player who gets drafted high who just isn't going to work out for the team. And this is going to be a big training camp, I think, for Elijah Jones, because as the third round pick, you would expect him to be able to come in. But Cardinals have an outside corner in Melton. They drafted Denzel Burke, at least, to be able to be part of that role. You already have another starter in Garrett Williams. We've talked about Keitrell Clark having to kind of go in and make a name for himself. But you really then are having to look at Starling Thomas, who's held off most of the other guys for quite a bit of time. You got an undrafted free agent who signed with you in Jalen Jones. The cornerback room is, because of just the nature of special teams, going to have probably one less guy than we're used to this year. And I think it may less be about Keitrell, and it may be more about whether Elijah Jones is able to stick on the roster. Does Jaden Davis be able to stick? Like, the cornerback room is probably going to be limited to about 5 guys this year, just because of the way the safety room is set up, if you're going to keep a top-of-the-line gunner in Keaton Crawford on your roster going into the season.
Yeah, that's the luxury of being drafted in the 6th and 7th round as a cornerback that's athletic. You already know you're going to be a special teams player. You're like, oh, we need a gunner. Oh, let's go get that safety or that cornerback with freakishly crazy talent and speed. Elijah Jones is really the guy that I'm really pulling for. Unfortunately, you already know how high I'm on Keitrell Clark, but he probably is not going to make the team. And I don't think it's going to be because of his talent. I think it's going to be because of something that happened within either year one with the coaching staff or year two. Because I'll be honest with you, I know people are very, very high on Starling Thomas. I don't see it. I don't understand. When I look at this guy in the film, I don't see anything that pops out other than him being able to keep up with players after they stack on him. That's a cornerback thing that everybody does. You can keep with wide receivers after they stack you because you're out of phase at that point and you're guarding the lower shoulder. So you have to keep up with your guy. Unless if you don't keep up with the guy, you're not an NFL player. You're that's how you tell the difference between a corner who belongs in the NFL and a corner that doesn't belong in the NFL. If you're sagging 2-3 yards behind your defender, behind the person you're defending, you're not an NFL player. So that's the only thing I can see about Starling Thomas. He doesn't break on the ball like I expect like a starting corner would. He doesn't. He makes good tackles. I guess that could be the one that separates him. Really good against the run. Those are the two things that I see. But when it comes to his coverage, there's just nothing special popping out. That's why I look at the room and I think to myself, why is Garrett Williams playing as the apex in this defense? Why don't you just put him on the outside? He was an outside corner before you drafted him. So it makes no sense that they suddenly shuffled him inside to play zone in a zone heavy defense, obviously, and he is elite at it. But we also do need that outside guy. So it was kind of like unlucky for Keitrell Clark to get drafted into this team as a 6th rounder because we had no idea Garrett Williams was going to play like the slot, and he did, and he took over that position. They're not moving him away from it. Now Keitrell Clark has no home. So Elijah Jones and
Elijah Jones maybe too. That's another option. At least when I looked at Elijah Jones coming out, I felt like you said, made some sense if Garrett was going to be with some of the size at outside corner and Elijah Jones could be moving into the slot. Even though Jones was, I think, at least as far as with the size, and I'm going to double check at least as far as with that, but he was a 6'1", 185, which you're talking about, at least with Garrett Williams, is very comparable, at least for that one. They're
He's
Garrett Williams is,
5'11".
I think, yeah, he's 5'10", 5'11 or so. So you're talking about, normally you would say that it would be flipped. When I looked at the skill sets where they played in college, like you said, Jones was actually showed some flexibility. So you would think that normally that would be the case. This is one of those spots, at least, where what's maybe, I don't know if it's the unfortunate, but takes out the intrigue is if Will Johnson ends up being that guy who falls to you, who is that number one outside corner, where then all of a sudden everything falls into place. You've got your backups, your rotational pieces. Elijah Jones can then be able to compete with Denzel Burke for one of these two roles. As far as the backup, you're able to move on from Keytrail, and then it comes down to ultimately just recognizing that you got clarity. Will Johnson, Max Melton are both round 2 picks. You also have Garrett Williams, who is a 3rd round pick. Those are the guys that are your high draft picks and should be your starters. That's where I think ultimately this is one of those cases where what would have probably been a lot of interesting debate and intrigue is kind of turned into, well, Sean Murphy bunting out is probably going to end up being Will Johnson. It's probably going to end up being the other two guys in Melton and Garrett Williams. Maybe it takes like a little bit for Will Johnson to be able to get out there, where maybe there's a game or two where Starling Thomas starts, but they rotate through some of those players. Now, speaking of highly drafted players and looking to perform, Marvin Harrison Jr. was the other last piece, at least, of training camp and OTAs we get to talk about, mostly because of these guns. Now, when we talk at least about ultimately,
Look at those guns.
Yeah, for those at least who are wondering, and this is one of the cases, there's always been a lot of debate about guys who put on weight, put on muscle strength. Some of the cases, I can at least give some personal insight here from last year with looking at some areas in scouting. Going into training camp last year and looking at what Marv had, there was areas where I could see as far as his feet, where you could at least be able to see like the way his feet chopped, the way he had his body control, like in camp when they'd throw these like, end zone fades, some back of the ears, you could say, okay, he's got at least that like elite little quickness and separation that made him a top 5 pick and one of the top receivers overall, at least in the loaded receiver draft class. The one thing at least that we did notice from that rookie training camp was like he had a little bit as far as with the arms, there was room to grow. Like it wasn't saying like that he was skinny. It wasn't saying that it was something where it's like some people compared to Devonta Smith, who, as we've kind of seen with the Eagles, he's been able to make plays outside and has used a lot of quickness to get open. But they've loved using him as a slot guy and a deep threat player there, at least on some of these different play action passes. Marv, for what it was worth, was put into a role that outside of being the main move guy, he was just kind of locked into being that X receiver, sacrificial type, had to be able to get off press and beat single coverage. There's a lot of times where when Kyler Murray went and connected with him, the ball placement was good. Marv got his hands on the ball. Ball got knocked out of his hands. Thinking of that touchdown that could have been Christian Gonzalez knocked away several times where he had opportunities to get the ball and just was not able to kind of fight through it. Some people question, is there a my ball mentality? What's going to be the case here? One thing I think that going into this offseason we said was when you get into an NFL weight room, you don't have to worry about like whether it's other classes or other pieces or just parts of the game that come with the collegiate aspect. You just get to focus full time on football. And a lot of what usually happens between college and the pros is college, you don't get that same sort of dedication, at least with the NFL training programs. And I think Marv got a wake-up call, realized if I'm going to be this guy who is going to be an outside X receiver in the league, and that's something that's still up for debate. Like a lot of what we wondered, at least as far as the statistics that we've seen, we can talk about with Michael Wilson. This was a step that I think he needed to be able to take in order to actually get away from also NFL cornerbacks who are just as jacked, who are going to be then trying to be able to knock the ball free on their livelihood or be able to lock him down. Marcos, this is a spot where I think even though the question is going to be, does the results make him slower? Does it gain too much weight? Is it one of the spots at least where you're putting a lot of emphasis onto the arms? And really what you need to look at is he going to be able to get open and separate? I think this is at least showing the one thing that we do for sure, which is Marv is going to put in the effort quietly to be able to get himself better and to improve as much as he can as a player, which is part of why he was so widely lauded as a prospect coming out. And it's going to be something where if you're going to be looking at an NFL cornerback and having to go up and get a ball this season, I think there is going to be a definite strength difference this year versus what we saw last season as far as some of these contested catches, which with how Kyler Murray treats his large targets outside is something that is going to be a part of, I think, whatever offense this quarterback is in, not Drew Petzing's offense notwithstanding.
Well, I mean, he looks like a defensive end right over here, and that's how he's going to play the position because when you have to get off a press, you have to do these tricks like the club swim technique and all these defensive end type of roles and stuff. So he has guns to be able to, like, good luck trying to beat this guy in press. Now he's just going to throw you on the ground. And he looks just like DK Metcalf here. Not even going to lie. So I don't think he's going to lose any speed because, well, the real hope is, has he been working on his legs too? Because it's not just all about his arms. His legs also need that strength so he can keep up with that speed or get faster up there. But that's going to be a great tool to be able to, like, get that ball and keep that ball from being, like, punched out or whatnot and everything, because that arm strength really does make a difference. And for people who are thinking, well, you know what, like, if you're making this transition in the NFL, then maybe you're giving up some speed or whatnot, and it might not be as effective. He's always gonna be and has been a guy that you're supposed to throw it to him, even if he's not, like, open, quote unquote, because he's supposed to be that get up and get it guy. And if people want to look at another example, Larry Fitzgerald had big arms too. So he grew his arm size when he got into the NFL. He did it so he can get off a press. He also really used that to his advantage when he got into the slot and started becoming more of a good blocking wide receiver. So that came in really, really handy. So I like the fact that he got himself like an extra 20 pounds on his arms.
Yeah, I think that's something, at least like we said, the expectations for Marv. He underperformed based on what we had wanted. We wanted 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. He ended up with about 800 yards, 8 touchdowns for the most part. Um, what's really interesting to me, at least, is that the Cardinals receivers, this is a large year for them because we saw last year that the Cardinals ultimately have a wide receiver one in Trey McBride. It's part of where we saw Kyler Murray was able to actually do well over the middle, off of play action. They were able to utilize Trey McBride all over the place. What we saw was that they had struggles when going to the outside where there was just inconsistency. And then there was also injury issues that we had, at least, with the factor that comes down to the other wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals. And that would be a player who, and this is a tweet from Hayden Winks, at least for the most part, when you're talking about when it comes to completion percentage on slant routes, out routes, dig routes last year. This means the highest number of passes were completed, at least for the most part. There was guys like a Jamar Chase was up there. A guy I think A.J. Brown was up there. The wide receiver 3 per Hayden Winks was Michael Wilson. He was ahead of Amon-Ra St. Brown, and it was a big outside receiver for the most part. So you're talking about running a slant route, out route, dig route. These are kind of these quick routes. So we're talking about how the Cardinals essentially last year utilized their offense. They had a guy who was elite at slant, out, and dig routes last year. They had 9 routes that they would run to Marvin Harrison Jr. that he was one of the, not like worst, but essentially they threw the most routes to him and he connected the least. They also, at least when it came to Michael Wilson, when you're talking about the way that things have lined up for the most part, at least with that, when you're talking about this is kind of fantasy terms about where guys are drafted for the most part as wide receiver 2 versus how good teams' defenses are. The Cardinals actually have the easiest schedule for wide receiver 2 against cornerback 2 when you're talking about team totals, specifically for how the gap is between Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride and the second wide receiver on the team in Michael Wilson. As you can see on the chart that's listed here, the teams that have the highest up wide receiver 2s drafted are the ones that make sense. They've got 2 elite threats: Bengals, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. The Los Angeles Rams, it's going to be Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams. You're talking about, at least for the Eagles, are up there. There is essentially for Arizona a huge gap between where people are taking Marvin Harrison Jr., what they think of him, and Michael Wilson. So I think this is one of those interesting cases, Marcos, where we talked a lot about what else we needed to see from camp. Michael Wilson, his health and his play, this is his 3rd year at the Cardinals. I don't know as far as what a contract would look like, but the expectation is pretty clear for him. They want him to get 1,000 yards. They want him to stay healthy. And this is going to be a crucial year for that, because if he gets through about maybe 8 or 9 games into the season, you're talking about the trade deadline coming up. Very possible the Cardinals could just say, we need to get this spot resolved. They make a trade, bring in an outside receiver who they're likely then going to pay since they'd have a little bit of flexibility with Marvin's contract. And that may end up being it for Michael Wilson's time in the desert. So there is a plus to if you're looking at least at the Cardinals. And then there's also a minus as far as when it comes to just what to look for in camp, because a lot of, like we said, the league can be is year to year. And it's especially important for year 3, as we always talk about with draft prospects. So that will be the last thing I think of training camp prep to look for. Let's wrap up at least with talking a little bit about just kind of a shout out to Josh Sweat being the 95th overall ranked player for the NFL 100. This is voted on by players, coaches also voted on, I believe, as well by fans. But for the most part, it's slanted to NFL players. Josh Sweat is a top 100 player this year. Cardinals signed him. They previously had 2 guys they added, such as DeAndre Hopkins and Chandler Jones, making the list. We'll see what happens as far as Budda Baker. My assumption is that maybe there's a chance he's dropped off of the list. My guess is he's going to potentially be on it, maybe even a little bit higher up, because this feels like it's been one of those years where making, at least with some of the accolades he's had, how the defense was able to overperform last year. We'll see if he's able to make it, but that was a nice shout out to see the Cardinals did bring in a quality prime free agent in signing. Last thing we can talk about is some of the NFL collusion conversation. So we'll talk a little bit about this as we wrap up, but ultimately the best way to sum it all up is Pablo Torre ends up finding out, part of his show name actually, that there was some documents he was able to get access to during the NFL collusion hearings to find out, did NFL owners actively work together to collude against players? And what it mostly comes down to, at least, is NFL owners talked about suppressing fully guaranteed quarterback contracts, such as Deshaun Watson once he received it from the Browns. Michael Bidwell has some texts back and forth with Dean Spanos of the Chargers, where they even talk about and said, hey, we've got a contract we're giving to Kyler Murray. It'll help your Justin Herbert contract. We're happy we've got a quarterback worth paying, which is kind of some big, hey, at least they had confidence in Kyler. We found out a couple of new things as well. Steve Keim talked about loading up the contract with guarantees to make it Kyler's going to have to work to get the guaranteed money. It won't just be this fully guaranteed contract. And we get to at least see that up front, the Cardinals, and some news that we probably weren't quite aware of, their first offer from the former agent of Kyler Murray, at least from what we know was former agent, was asking for a fully guaranteed deal similar to Deshaun Watson's. And what we saw with NFL owners is that they essentially kind of put a lot of guarantees into the contract with Kyler's deal, eventually got that worked out. We saw Lamar Jackson, who was available with a franchise tag for 2 first-round picks. He seemed to want a fully guaranteed contract. No team paid the draft picks. No team made any sort of offer, reached out or contacted him at all. What it really looks like, at least for each of these, is that it probably seems like NFL owners went and said, hey, should we be giving players, or especially quarterbacks, the most important position on the field, fully guaranteed deals? The answer is the market would probably seem to dictate yes. However, owners seem to be, in this case, while there was never actual, conviction of collusion, there is, whether you call settlements for the most part, what popped up, it just kind of is a spot where you got 32 owners who do not want to pay quarterbacks, probably what quarterbacks could have ultimately, Marcos. Kyler Murray actually gave some deposition in this area where he shared some of the text messages back and forth, became public knowledge. Ultimately, at the end of the day, this is something where you could either completely overreact to it, say this is a huge bombshell. The other side is there's an acceptance level of this is just kind of how the NFL works, where it's not going to be a everyone's hands are clean sort of business. You're not going to see anything as far as, I think, something to worry about between the Cardinals and Kyler Murray. It seems like with the deal done, with everything how it's set up, even Kyler coming back from injury, it's just part of ultimately what the business looks like. I think that what a lot of fans at least should be looking forward to is you don't want your players to not get paid, or at least to not get paid what they're worth, because players, when they're paid what they're worth, are happy players. And often with the rookie quarterback contracts, they're not making as much money as they probably should have been making. Kyler was making probably about $10 million a year for the most part for the first 3 to 4 years of his contract, in which the Cardinals got out of their number 1 overall pick doldrums, got to the playoffs, got to see some high-performing offense at times. They have seen some struggles in which it may factor into Kyler Murray's next contract, but think what it can take away for the most part, at least, Marcos, is a lot of people have just looked at how things stand with Arizona, and we can say is it's not that Michael Bidwell is special or different. It's just this is part of how owners run their business, at least, and part of where players, being 1,000 or so sort of players in the National Football League, just don't have necessarily the ability to be able to actually get that second extra push of a fully guaranteed contract. What are your thoughts as we wrap up our show today with just some of how we've seen with this relationship between owners and players? Just there's going to be, I think, a lot that we can probably go deeper into on this, but there's probably not much I think that we couldn't spend, I think, like hours and hours worth that wouldn't ultimately end up at the same spot, which is owners and players are working through a lot of this stuff to kind of figure out how things are moving forward. And we just have to be able to look at and hope that, like the Cardinals said with Michael Bidwell and Steve Keim, that you've got a quarterback who is worth paying. And that's how they felt about Kyler Murray.
Well, we already kind of knew like the whispers of like owners working together and getting like them getting pissed off that somebody like Deshaun Watson got that big guaranteed contract, because we knew that was going to play into like, hey, now every quarterback's going to think to themselves, oh, we didn't know that was even possible. Let's go ahead and let's push for that. So every single agent from every quarterback that was due a contract was pushing for that same reason. You're going to have Deshaun Watson, who has all these cases, who has all this bag, all this bags and everything like that of like legal uh, issues that he has outside of the NFL, is going to get this fully guaranteed contract and is going to get this big, trade by the Cleveland Browns. Well, the what they were trying to announce after that was like, no, that wasn't the case. It was just Cleveland Browns being the Cleveland Browns. They're very irresponsible. They make bad decisions like this. No, no, no. Just don't pay attention to that. That's exactly what they would do anyway. That's the Cleveland Browns
That was the,
show.
yeah,
So that's what they would say.
desperation at least of losing out on Deshaun Watson, probably to the Atlanta Falcons. They decided to offer, hey, that fully guaranteed deal to one up despite being out of it. As we've seen, at least, like there is a point of showing if you're going to be doing a fully guaranteed contract for a player, there can be issues like they're going having to pay out for him millions. At least he's not going to be on the team. Like just the way that things have worked out, there is a point, at least I've seen, of, hey, if you give a guy a fully guaranteed contract, the NFL is a year-to-year sort of league due to injuries, just because unlike the NBA where guys can play like into their 40s, we see guys at least who retire like before they get to age 30. We've seen guys at least who have had Hall of Fame level careers that just are just their bodies are destroyed. Like it turns into a year-to-year sort of thing. And it's one of the spots where like you kind of have to be able to look at all the different sides of it. And at the end of the day, I think it's not going to matter as much for this current contract because, as we said, Kyler got paid. They worked it out. He's on a top 11 deal out of the quarterback. He's not even in the top 10 of quarterback salaries per year anymore. What's going to really factor in is going to be next year, because Kyler has a good year, gets to the playoffs, even wins a playoff game, you're going to be looking at him and his camp coming back to look for another contract, which of course is going to set a whole bunch of other things into motion. If he doesn't get to that level for the most part, it does feel like Arizona is going to have to make a decision, because then at that point, you're either going to have to just play it out with him, or you're going to be kind of saying, hey, we're going to have to look at figuring out how can we make a change, make a reset for the most part sometime between the 2026 and 2027 season. All it is to say for the most part is that ultimately, with where Michael Bidwell and the Cardinals stand, there's a lot of teams that would love to be in Arizona's shoes, I think, at least. A team like the Giants, for example, at least, are in a spot where they've got just throwing stuff at the wall, hoping it sticks. Arizona is at least in a position of strength. But it's a position of strength for owners, as we've talked about, versus players. And I think that is something that seems likely to continue. That is going to be it here for the Redbird Reboot podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll be back at least with some more stuff with training camp, as well as some other news with the podcast. Marcos, if you want to help close us out for today, that would be awesome. And then I'll be able to wrap us up with where you can find our show.
All right. So just closing out, final thoughts. Can't wait to see what this summer brings on for the Cardinals and whatnot. I know it's kind of hard to concentrate on that with other things that are going on, but hopefully this could be a positive for a lot of people. You can find me at Panking Soul. You can find Blake Murphy at Blake Murphy7 on Twitter, or X and whatnot. And of course, Redbird Reboot YouTube channel. You guys can also engage with us there whenever we have these streams and whatnot. And hope you guys have a wonderful day.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You can follow us on Spotify at the Redbird Reboot Podcast, as well as Apple Podcasts on YouTube. Make sure you're following our channel for the most part. That'll be it for us, at least. I'm Blake Murphy7. That is Marcos Labrada. This has been the Redbird Reboot Podcast. And guys, this Cardinals 2025 offseason's pretty much come to a close. We just have training camp to look forward to before the Cardinals. They kind of entered their own sort of reboot to get to that next version of that 53-man roster. Thank you guys for tuning in, and go Cardinals. Have a wonderful rest of your week.